Imagine spending 300 years building the perfect wall, only to watch it become a death trap in the time it takes to load a single cannon. That is exactly what happened to Europe's castles. For centuries, these fortresses had been unbeatable. A lord with thick stone, a deep moat, and enough grain and storage could sit behind those walls and laugh at armies 10 times his size. Kings rose and fell, depending on which castles they controlled, and wars dragged on for decades, because breaking into one of these fortresses could take years of siege. Then, in the span of a single human lifetime, every one of those towering walls turned into rubble waiting to happen. The killer was not a bigger army or a brilliant general. It was a metal tube, some black powder, and a stone bowl. So picture the panic that must have set in among military leaders across the continent. Everything they had trusted to keep their people safe was suddenly useless, and nobody had a replacement ready. The turning point came in 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II marched his army to the gates of Constantinople. That city had walls so strong they had turned back invaders for over 1,000 years. But Mehmed brought something new. Giant bronze cannons, capable of firing stone balls that weighed over 500 kilograms. Within weeks, those legendary walls were cracking apart. And by the end of May, the city had fallen. If Constantinople could be broken, then no fortress on earth was truly safe anymore. And every kingdom in Europe knew it. Here is the part that most people get wrong when they think about this problem. It was not simply that cannons were powerful. It was that the entire shape of a castle was suddenly working against itself. Medieval walls were built tall on purpose because height helped defenders pour boiling oil, shoot arrows downward, and keep attackers from climbing over. That logic made perfect sense against men with swords and ladders. But a tall, thin wall is actually the worst possible shape to put in front of a cannonball, because all that force slams straight into a narrow strip of stone with nothing to absorb the blow. One well-placed barrage at the base of a tower, and the whole structure would come crashing down like a felled tree. Even the shape of the towers themselves turned into a hidden weakness. Round towers had always been seen as the smartest design in castle building, but their curves created blind spots where defenders simply could not aim. Attackers could hide right up against the base of the wall, completely safe from anyone shooting from above. Against soldiers with swords, that gap in coverage barely mattered. But against men digging tunnels packed with explosives, it was a fatal flaw waiting to be exploited. Italian engineers noticed both problems at almost the same time, and instead of trying to patch the old system, they started asking a much bigger question. What if the whole idea of a defensive wall needed to be rebuilt from scratch? 2 sieges proved just how far this new thinking could go. At Pisa in 1500, defenders facing a collapsing stone wall threw together a desperate solution: a sloped wedge of packed earth behind the broken section. Something incredible happened. Cannonballs that would have shattered stone simply buried themselves harmlessly in the dirt, and the sloped angle sent other shots skidding off into the sky. A few years later, at Padua, a monk-turned-military engineer named Fra Giocondo did something even bolder. He tore down the ancient medieval walls on purpose, replacing them with a wide ditch and low earthen ramparts fitted with platforms that jutted outward. When the French army attacked, their cannons barely scratched the low earthworks. This is where the real breakthrough happened, and it came down to one deceptively simple shape: the bastion. Instead of round towers, engineers began building arrow-shaped points that jutted outward from the walls at each corner. Picture a fortress shaped like a star, because that is essentially what these forts became. The genius of this design was something called flanking fire. Any attacker trying to approach the wall between two bastions would be caught in crossfire from both sides, with defenders shooting straight along the face of the wall instead of just downward. There were no blind spots left to hide in anymore. Every single approach to the fortress was covered by overlapping lines of fire, and soldiers who used to feel safe hugging the base of a wall now found themselves standing in the open with nowhere to hide.
Engineers did not stop at the bastion either. They layered defense after defense around it, like the rings of an onion. First came a wide ditch circling the entire fortress, using the very dirt dug out of it to build up the ramparts above. Beyond the ditch stretched a long, gentle slope called a glacis, forcing attackers to march uphill directly into gunfire, while also deflecting incoming cannon shots harmlessly overhead. Triangular outworks sat in the ditch itself, acting like extra shields and firing platforms in front of the main wall. To even reach the fortress, a soldier had to cross open ground under fire, drop into a trench designed as a killing zone, fight past an extra defensive point, and then somehow scale a sloped earthen wall while being shot at from 3 directions at once. Sieges that once took days against an old castle now dragged on for entire seasons against one of these star-shaped forts.
The most breathtaking example of this idea was Palma Nova, a city built by Venice in 1593 in the shape of a 9-pointed star, with streets radiating outward from a central plaza like spokes on a wheel. Seen from above, it looks like something drawn with a compass rather than built by human hands, and it still exists today as a protected heritage site. Genius after genius took up this new science of defense. Even Michelangelo himself designed fortifications for Florence during a siege in 1529. Foreign kingdoms became so desperate for this expertise that Italian engineers were hired across the continent, which is exactly why the French started calling this design the Trace Italienne, literally the Italian outline.
But it took a Frenchman to push this system to its absolute limit. Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban was born into minor nobility in 1633, and he rose through the ranks under King Louis XIV purely on skill rather than birth. Over his lifetime, Vauban oversaw work on more than 160 fortresses, personally directing construction at over 300 sites, while riding tens of thousands of kilometers across France on horseback. What made him truly dangerous was that he understood both sides of the equation perfectly.
He built these fortresses, but he also developed devastatingly effective methods for tearing them down, digging zigzag trenches ever closer to enemy walls while artillery pounded away at point-blank range. He reportedly led more than 40 successful sieges and never once lost, using every weakness he found as an attacker to make his own fortresses stronger.
These star-shaped fortresses eventually spread across the entire globe. The Dutch built their own version, using flooded moats and canals to make attacks even harder, while Spain and Portugal carried the design to colonies stretching from the Philippines to Brazil to the coasts of Africa. A handful of soldiers behind one of these forts could control an entire harbor or mountain pass against forces many times their size, projecting the power of a small nation across oceans. Historians have argued that simply knowing whether a region was covered in these fortresses could predict how a war would unfold, turning some conflicts into grinding siege after siege, while leaving other regions open to fast, decisive battles.
Nothing stays undefeated forever, though, and the same force that created these forts eventually destroyed them too. Better weapons. By the mid-1800s, explosive shells had replaced solid cannonballs, and instead of burying themselves harmlessly in earthen ramparts, they detonated on impact and tore through the walls. During the war between France and Prussia in 1870, fortresses that had stood for 2 centuries were demolished in a matter of days by rifled steel cannons firing these new explosive rounds. Just like the castle before it, the Star Fort had finally been overtaken by technology it could not withstand.
Even so, the deeper lesson never went away. For 3 centuries, this single idea shaped how wars were fought and how nations survived. All because a group of engineers refused to keep building higher walls and instead built smarter ones. Many of these forts are still standing today, some preserved as World Heritage Sites, looking so precisely geometric that people assume a computer must have designed them centuries before computers existed. And that core insight, that clever design can outmatch raw force, still shapes everything from modern missile defense to cybersecurity today, proving that the smartest solution rarely comes from building bigger. It comes from thinking differently.